The arrival of evening in pre-electric Europe. Before electricity, evening in Europe didn't begin suddenly. No buttons were pressed. Lights didn't switch on instantly. Evening was felt gradually. As the sun set, shadows began to lengthen. Stone streets began to cool. Movements in houses slowed down. No one said, "It's night," because everyone already knew it. As the light diminished, time seemed to pass with difficulty. The hustle and bustle of the day gave way to silence. This wasn't a frightening moment. On the contrary, it was a familiar and expected transition. In Europe, evening was like a pause. It wasn't the end of the day, but the harbinger of the coming of night, the middle evening rhythm of Europe. In the pre-electric world, people didn't enter the night alone. Evening was greeted together. They sat at the same table, looked at the same fire, and prepared for the same darkness together. Even in wealthy homes, evenings were simple. Lavish meals were rarely seen. Because the lights were limited and time was considered short, evening was a time for sharing. To sit quietly, listen, and wait. The same thing happened across Europe, in villages, towns, and early cities. The day ended, night slowly arrived, and people didn't resist it. Soon the sun would be completely gone. The light would fade even further. The lamps weren't lit yet. The darkness wasn't quite complete. This moment represented the final threshold between day and night, and people crossed this threshold silently. The slowing down of evening in pre-electric Europe. In Europe, before electricity, evening was one of the most peaceful and distinct times of the day. People knew how to behave in the absence of light. When the sun began to set, no one was surprised. It was something everyone expected. Evening arrived the same way every day, and everyone felt it. Work slowed down. Those in the fields watched the sun's movement carefully. In cities, shops gradually closed. No one tried to do one more thing at the last minute, because evening represented a transition point. Once that point was reached, the pace of life changed completely. The interiors of homes gained more importance. Doors were closed, windows were shut, and the few light sources inside were used carefully. A candle, an oil lamp, or a fireplace fire. These not only provided light, but also showed how time was passing. The less light there was, the closer night was. People acted knowing this. Dinner and the quiet end of the day. Before electricity, dinner in Europe was one of the simplest times of the day. Eating at this hour was less of a spectacle and more of the closing of the day. As the light diminished, the tables became simpler. Instead of long tables, small groups gathered around a fire were preferred. Everyone tried to carefully examine the food in front of them. Meals weren't consumed quickly because there was no need to rush. The day's fatigue had already slowed their movements. Conversations also progressed slowly. Long sentences were avoided. Unnecessary chatter was avoided. Dinner was the last shared experience of the day. The last laugh, the last glance, the last story. During this period, the outside world gradually receded. The noise of the streets no longer reached inside. Only the sound of the fire and the gentle clinking of plates remained. When the meal was over, the day was considered over, but no one voiced this aloud. dinner and the quiet end of the day. Before electricity, dinner in Europe was one of the simplest times of the day. Eating at this hour was less of a spectacle and more of the closing of the day. As the light diminished, the tables became simpler. Instead of long tables, small groups gathered around a fire were preferred. Everyone tried to carefully examine the food in front of them. Meals weren't consumed quickly because there was no need to rush. The day's fatigue had already slowed their movements. Conversations also progressed slowly. Long sentences were avoided. Unnecessary chatter was avoided. Dinner was the last shared experience of the day. The last laugh, the last glance, the last story. During this period, the outside world gradually receded. The noise of the streets no longer reached inside. Only the sound of the fire and the gentle clinking of plates remained. When the meal was over, the day was considered over, but no one voiced this aloud. The emptying of the streets and the transition to night. As evening approached, the cities and towns of Europe gradually began to fall silent. This silence didn't happen suddenly. It occurred gradually. First, the crowds dispersed. Then, the footsteps faded. Finally, the doors closed. The streets seemed wider than they had been during the day because no one remained inside. Only those who truly needed to were out. A messenger, a late traveler, or a guard on duty, but even their steps were slow. Night disliked haste. The faint lights filtering through the windows were the last living remnants of the city. These lights, too, faded one by one. Europe accepted the night without resistance. Darkness was not an enemy, but a veil. At this hour, the world felt narrower. Everything was closer. Everything was quieter, and with this silence, people prepared for sleep. The slowing down of time inside homes as night falls. In Europe, before electricity, time took on a different form as night fell. Clocks may have existed, but no one looked at them. Time was measured by the presence of light. As the fire diminished, the night grew longer. As the candles melted, conversations decreased. Movements within the house became almost invisible. Even a person moving was done silently, because night had its own order and no one wanted to disrupt it. People spoke less at this hour. Every word spoken felt heavier in the darkness. Therefore, silence was generally preferred. The silence wasn't disturbing. On the contrary, the thoughts accumulated during the day found peace in this silence. Looking at the same fire, watching the same shadows, facing the same darkness, this shared experience constituted the most powerful aspect of the night. Night wasn't consumed, night was experienced. The final moments in European homes as sleep approaches. As night progressed, the body grew heavier. But this heaviness wasn't boring. This was due to a natural weariness. The beds weren't luxurious, but they were adequate. Sleep came not with comfort, but with habit, and people didn't make lengthy preparations before going to sleep. The night itself was a process of preparation. The fire had to be checked one last time before going out. The doors were examined. Everything was checked to make sure it was in its place. Then the light slowly faded. The candle went out. The room became completely dark. In this darkness, no one panicked, because darkness was something familiar. Outside, the night breeze blew gently. A dog's bark could be heard in the distance, but these things didn't disturb the peaceful atmosphere. Sleep wasn't an escape. It was part of the natural flow of the night, and Europe breathed a deep sigh of relief with this silence. European roads and inns as night falls. Before electricity, nightlife in Europe wasn't confined to homes. Night also unfolded on the roads, but these roads weren't like the ones we knew during the day. Traveling after sunset wasn't a choice, often a necessity. People had to stop when the light wasn't enough, because night didn't allow for rapid movement. European roads became quieter as evening approached. The sound of wheels diminished, the clatter of horses' hooves became less frequent, and human voices almost completely disappeared. Those traveling at this hour didn't hurry. Haste was fraught with danger in the dark. Inns were therefore important. They weren't destinations, but resting places. As evening neared, the lights of the inns became visible from afar. A candle, a window, or the warm light emanating from a doorway. These lights not only provided guidance, but also created a sense of security. Once inside the inns, no one spoke loudly. The travelers were weary. The day was already behind them. Different people sat at the same table. A merchant, a messenger, a peasant. But as evening fell, these differences became blurred. Everyone joined in the same silence. The travelers, silence, and the intertwining of night. As night progressed in the inns, the atmosphere grew increasingly peaceful. This tranquility didn't arise suddenly. The fire slowly subsided, the light gradually faded, and movement became almost imperceptible. Initially, small sounds could still be heard. A chair sliding, a door slowly closing, a faint crackling from the fire. But as time passed, these sounds also disappeared. Night settled into the inn's atmosphere. The travelers didn't ask many questions. Who came from where? Where are they going? These were the curiosities of the day. Night, however, was a time of rest. Night itself had no questions. Only its existence was present. Some would close their eyes and doze off gazing at the fire. Eyes half closed, thoughts slowed. The dance of the flames calmed the mind. Some would lean against the wall, waiting silently. They neither wanted to talk nor to sleep completely. Sleep didn't rush. It came slowly, like an invitation. The paths outside were completely shrouded in darkness. The paths familiar during the day seemed to belong to one another at night. If the moon was present, it softened the landscape somewhat. It lengthened the shadows, creating an indistinct yet peaceful atmosphere. Otherwise, the darkness leveled everything. The stone, the earth, the people. In that darkness, no one felt alone, because everyone felt the same emotions. The night. In Europe, night was not an individual experience, but a time shared by all. At the same hours, in different cities, in different houses, people were enveloped in a similar silence. Travelers, like those at home, adapted to the rhythm of the night. There was no noise, no entertainment, no forced silence, only a state of being, without haste, without expectation, simply. When the inns fell silent, when the fires had dimmed, when the roads were completely empty, Europe sailed into a deep sleep. The settlement of night and the silence of Europe. Night had now completely taken over. Not much would change after this hour. Only the silence would deepen. The last movements inside the houses would occur slowly. The straightening of a blanket, the gentle closing of a window, a final glance at the fire. These were the small signs indicating the arrival of night. No one resisted the night, because it was clear that night was not something to be overcome. Everyone was accustomed to it and witnessed it. In Europe, as night progressed, it did not completely separate from day. However, the weight of the day had disappeared. Thoughts became gentler. Memories circulated more quietly in the mind. The mind began to gather itself. The streets were completely deserted. Footsteps were not heard. Doors were closed. The lights in the windows had long since gone out. Only the sound of a gentle breeze or an indistinct night sound from afar could be heard. But these sounds did not break the silence. They became a part of it. Night spread over Europe like a heavy but peaceful blanket. The approach of sleep and the silent end of the day. At these hours, sleep didn't come suddenly. No one suddenly detached themselves from the world. Sleep came gradually. This change was felt in the body. Muscles relaxed, breathing deepened. The mind began to let go of the day's details. Unnecessary thoughts began to disappear. In their place came a simple peace. In Europe, people didn't make plans for tomorrow as they fell asleep, because tomorrow would come with the sun. The only thing that mattered at that moment was to journey through the night. The beds were simple, the rooms dark, the world silent. This silence wasn't an emptiness. It expressed a state of rest. At this moment of the night, everyone experienced a similar situation. The same darkness, the same silence, the same slowness. Europe felt like a single whole at these hours. It was breathing, resting, leaving the day behind. Sleep was not an end, but a renewal. The meaning of time disappears as night deepens. As night progressed, the understanding of time in Europe grew increasingly blurred. The importance of hours faded. Minutes weren't counted. Asking, "What time is it?" in the middle of the night wouldn't occur to anyone. Time had ceased to be something measurable and had become a felt state. No one in the houses considered how long they had been awake, because at this hour of the night, even thoughts progressed slowly. The fire had long since begun to die down. Only the memory of warmth remained. This warmth was felt not in the walls, but within the people. This time of night in Europe wasn't entirely separate from day, but day seemed so far away. The outside world became indistinct. Cities seemed to disappear. Roads, squares, doors, all became similar in the darkness. At this hour, night became not just a period of time, but a state of mind. People entered this state, not by force, but naturally. The mind could no longer think sharply. Thoughts remained incomplete, sentences unfinished. And this incompleteness didn't bother people. On the contrary, it comforted them. Silent Europe and the middle of the night. The middle of the night was the quietest time for Europe. It was neither a beginning nor an end. It was simply the night itself. This moment had no connection with the day. The hustle and bustle of the day had long since ended. The hopes of the morning had not yet shone. Time seemed to be compressed between 2 points. At this hour, the inns were completely peaceful. The doors were closed, the fires seemed about to go out, the conversations had long since ceased. The travelers were in a deep sleep. Sleep had not hurried, it had come slowly, unnoticed. Tired bodies had silently surrendered. The horses had settled down to rest, their heads bowed, their breathing regular. They too had been freed from the burden of the day. The roads were fading into oblivion. The stones no longer bore footprints. Dust did not rise. No one asked for directions. Even the breathing in the houses had become invisible. Everything was in a similar rhythm. People, walls, objects, all were adapting to the tempo of the night. Europe felt like a single sound at this moment. A low, deep, continuous sound. It wasn't noise, more the feeling of life, the sound of silence itself. The night seemed about to stop. It stood still. There was no movement, no expectation. This stillness wasn't unsettling. On the contrary, it was reassuring because no one had to rush anywhere. The clocks had abandoned their duties. Time didn't pressure anyone. At this hour, the world expected nothing from humanity. It didn't want them to work, think, or speak. It only demanded their existence. And people didn't struggle to comply. Without objection, without questioning, night had completely enveloped Europe. But this wasn't a siege. It was a soft, silent, heavy shroud. Under this shroud, everyone was equal. Traveler, host, awake or asleep. Night simplified everything. Names, roles, anxieties. Only humanity remained. And the silence that surrounded it. The moment the night began to dissipate, when the darkest moment of the night passed, no one in Europe could understand it, because this change was not visible to the eye. There were no signs, no sound was heard, no announcement was made, but the night was no longer like the night before. Darkness still enveloped everything. The streets were still empty. The houses still remained silent. However, the weight within the night had begun to lessen imperceptibly. This lessening was felt within people. The body was slowly relaxing. Those who were asleep were moving from a deep layer of sleep to a more superficial stage. No one had yet woken, but sleep was not as heavy as before. At this hour in Europe, the night seemed to be more in the process of letting go. Like a burden carried for a long time. We were still in their hands, but soon we would be put down. Travelers were still resting in the inns, but their breathing had changed. It was more regular and lighter. The horses did not move, but their ears were open to responding to the small changes within the night. Even the wind outside was beginning to blow in a different way, gentler and freer. Night was still present, but now it was dominant. The silence before dawn and the reflow of time. These hours were rarely spoken of in Europe, for these moments belonged neither to night nor to day. Morning had not yet arrived, but night had lost its effect. During these times, time began to flow again, but very slowly, as if awakened from a long sleep. No one moved in the houses, but the objects didn't seem as heavy as they had been at night. The walls, windows, doors, everything awaited the day. A special calm hung over Europe at these hours, as deep as the silence of night, but lighter. The silence carried a sense of anticipation, but it wasn't hasty. Some people tossed and turned in their sleep. Some opened their eyes briefly, then closed again. This wakefulness wasn't intentional. Rather, it was a natural reflex of the body. The fires in the inns had long since gone out, but the cold didn't yet bother them. For night was still fulfilling its final duty: protection. Europe, at these hours, was still within the night, but now night continued its existence as an embrace. Soon, a little later, the first sounds would be heard: a bird, a footstep, a creaking door. But the moment had not yet arrived. At this moment, only the present existed, the narrow interval between the end of night and the beginning of day. Europe advanced in silence during this interval, for this silence is the last breath between two worlds. The great silence that remained after the night. When the night ended, Europe was still silent. But this silence had become softer. It was as if the night was gently receding. Travelers sleeping in inns didn't feel it. Horses standing in the darkness didn't know that morning had come. People living in their homes were in a timeless peace. There was no electricity, no clocks, no warnings, no one thought about the beginning of the day. Because life moved slowly. Nights demanded nothing from people. They didn't expect them to produce anything, to converse, or to be strong. All they had to do was give them a chance to rest. In Europe, night was not a dark time, but a period of rest. The weight of the day slowly lightened with the night. The roads fell silent, the inns quieted, and people simply existed. Perhaps that's why sleep was deeper in those times. Thoughts flowed more slowly. Life was quieter. This video was a small window into the nights of the past, to the pre-electricity era, to a world that moved at a leisurely pace, to a life where silence was still considered normal. If this silence made you happy, if you felt the rhythm of the night, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Because here, history doesn't make noise. It doesn't rush. On the contrary, it only whispers. Now it's time to fall asleep. I wish you sweet dreams.